Hello and welcome to another video for TCGplayer.com. My name is Steve Rubin. Today we are doing a Bant Knightfall in Modern, and below after this there's not one league, but I actually did two leagues with a deck to show you guys how to play it and whatnot. Let's go ahead and jump right into the deck tech. I think that Bant Retreat, some people call it, is sort of, a deck that I'm not going to say it's underplayed, but it's just one of those fringe modern decks that you don't play very much. Recently, I believe it was a gentleman named Hyper went 7-1 at Magic Online Championship quarterly. No, oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, quarterly? No, a monthly, excuse me, which means, a pretty stiff competition and a pretty solid finish with the deck. That list is on my article page, but the idea is he took Ely Cassis's Bant Knightfall deck that, had been doing okay for a while, but not many people played it, and he added Spell Queller. So that kind of changes the deck. It gives the deck an additional interaction, which is important. And another thing is that we've seen some bannings in Modern, and these bannings, they don't obviously impact this deck. They make a lot of other decks worse, which is good for Bant. And, if people are playing less spot removal because they don't have to deal with the Jataxian Probe Become Immense decks as much, that's pretty good for the Knight deck because your Knights go uncontested more often. And let's go ahead and get into the deck tech itself. So 4 Path to Exiles, these are only spells, so to speak, in the deck other than Retreat. In Modern, it's pretty important to have cheap interaction, and Path to Exile, while it's not great, I actually found that pathing sometimes is really not detrimental, but, pathing an aggressive deck, giving that extra land is a pretty big deal. But it's just kind of a necessary evil. You need to make sure you don't die to Infect, or you don't die to Affinity, stuff like that. And it's just hyper efficient. Like, you are giving them a land, but you are only spending 1 mana, and it's an instant. It's pretty nice. Pretty much every white deck in Modern that's trying to play fair plays Path to Exile. So here we see 4, no big surprises. 3 Birds of Paradise, 4 Noble Hierarchs. Noble Hierarch is obviously the reason that a deck like this can exist. It's your Mox with Exalted, so to speak. It is an insane card. Lets us skip our 2-drop, go straight to 3. Makes our companies better because it lets us play lands essentially that are hits. Noble Hierarchs aren't great to hit, Noble Hierarchs aren't great to hit off company, but sometimes they can be reasonable, and the Exalted is definitely not something to scoff at. 3 Birds, just to give us some more power, just some more speed on the early end. Also fixes our mana a little bit, which can be helpful because we're splashing for red for stuff like Kessig Wolfrun and Is It Staticaster. So that's pretty much why we have the Birds. 4 Birds, you just don't want to get mana creature flooded. You'd rather have lands, you'd rather just have additional lands because it's at the point where, you don't want to be too reliant on creature mana, because if your opponent has, a Lightning Bolt or Electrolyze, stuff like that, they can keep you off the mana. And here is where the deck gets kind of interesting, because you look at this and you say, Steve, this can't possibly be right. You're playing 5 different 2-drops, 2 of each of them. And let's go ahead and touch on that a little bit. Just before talking about the 2-drops themselves, you're a company deck, so you actually see a decent amount of the cards in your deck. So having different situational 2-drops is pretty nice. The other thing is Modern is a pretty wide format, and some cards are hosers, but bad against other decks. For example, like Scavenging Ooze is obviously insane if we play against Dredge, reasonable if we play against fair decks, but if we play against Ad Nauseam or something, it's just a Grizzly Bear. So it's important not to have too many of a card that is super strong, and the problem is there aren't that many 2-drops other than Tarmogoyf that are really universally good in Modern in terms of a Bant deck, what you can play. And the problem with Tarmogoyf is our deck doesn't play any sorceries. We only play 8 instants and creatures, no planeswalkers or anything like that. So Tarmogoyf doesn't really fit that well in this deck because we have no way of fueling it. So we're playing, a bunch of different 2-drops. And like I said, if you watch the videos below, you will see that a lot of the times, having this 2-drop suite helps me a lot because I'll side out. I'll side out, for instance, 2 Selfless Spirits and 2 Voices, and I'll leave in the ones that I need. It gives me a lot of options and versatility post-board. But let's go ahead and go through the specifics. 2 Selfless Spirit, a card that has decently surprised me. It's kind of like a a Spellskite that can attack, if that makes sense. Obviously, you're not stopping your opponent's mutagenic growths or whatever with it, but it protects your Knight, it protects your Spell Queller, and it protects your Tireless Tracker, which all of those threats, you know, if they go uncontested, like I said before, you'll usually be able to win the game. So Selfless Spirit's solid, also helps you against sweepers. This deck is pretty weak against sweepers. As you see, we're playing 29 creatures and 4 companies, which is essentially 4 more creatures. So that's 33 creatures. Obviously, company you can end of turn and whatnot, but Selfless Spirit helps us against Anger, it helps us against Damnation, Supreme Verdict, stuff like that. It's pretty nice to have Selfless Spirit, and flying is not anything to... flying is good. Like, there aren't that many creatures that block flyers. In Modern, we have 6 Exalted creatures, we have 4 other flyers. Killing them in the air is a real possibility. Scavenging Ooze, this is a card that, you know, Hyper played 4 of, and it's possible you should play more. The reason I don't like Scavenging Ooze more than 2 is that this deck isn't a Lightning Bolt deck, it's a Path to Exile deck. We don't actually have ways of, like, putting our opponent's creatures into the graveyard. We're just relying on, you know, them killing our creatures to make the Ooze good. So Ooze is more of a utility card just against Dredge, and is also okay in fair matchups. It's sometimes good to draw on multiples, because if they kill the first one, the second one kind of takes over the game. But in general, if you play 4, you're going to run into a lot of spots where, you know, you just have 2 oozes and you have no way of getting creatures into the graveyard, and it's pretty sloppy. So that's why we're only playing 2 oozes. You can definitely play more if you want to be better against Dredge. That's completely reasonable. 2 Kusali Pride Mages, pretty much a staple in most green-white decks. You need to be able to kill cards like Phyrexian Unlife. You need to be able to kill Ensnaring Bridge. Obviously, these are... I'm not going to say they're corner cases, because these decks are real decks, but once in a blue moon when you play against a deck, or speaking of blue moon, you Blood Moon, once in a blue moon when you play against a deck where Pride Mage is good, like Affinity, it's really nice to have, you know. If you have no outs to Ensnaring Bridge, or you have no way, you know, outs to killing a Cranial Plating, you're just going to lose a lot more, because this deck, not 2 Pride Mages goes a longer way when you have company, because you can find the stuff. You can more likely to find it with company, you know. If you draw 5 or 6 cards in a 6-turn game of Modern, and then you play a company for 6 more cards, you know, that means 7 plus 6 plus 6, 12, and that's 19. You go through 19 cards in your deck. So, you know, if you have 2 Pride Mages, you're actually favored to find one in a scenario similar to that. 2 Voice Resurgence. This is kind of my own tech, and like I said in my article, I kind of built this deck to beat fair decks. I want to just beat Jund. I want to beat Grixis Control. You know, I want to beat other mid-rangey green decks, and I think that Voice is solid. It doesn't really fit this deck that well, because we have no, like, sacrifice going on or anything like that, but it makes them play on our terms. I really like having the Voice in play in any game. Like, sometimes the 2/2 body is not that relevant, but it just makes it so your opponent can't mess with you on your turn, which is really nice. 2 Spellskites, kind of weaker now that Jataxian Probe is banned, because there's a direct correlation between Jataxian Probe and Become Immense, but I still think it's super important to have Spellskite. If you play against Infect or Death Shadow Zoo, you know, turn 2 Spellskite, even like accompanied turn 3 or turn 4 Spellskite, can just win you the game outright, and it's not a bad card. And like I said, there aren't that many good 2-drops, which is why you see, like, no 4 of, you see all these 2 ofs. And Spellskite, at the very worst, is going to protect your Knight, it's going to protect your Tracker, it's going to protect your Spell Queller, which are the real, like, heavy hitters of the deck, you know. If you can protect those, you should be able to take over the game. Let's go ahead and get into the 3-drops. But first, we're going to go over Retreat. Now, this deck, some people play 2 Retreats, some people play even more Retreats. I have actually found in my testing that, and I just started testing the Retreat, I played this deck a long time without any Retreats on Magic Online, and I found that I was winning a lot of the time without Retreat. And part of that was Tireless Tracker. If you look at the synergy between Tireless Tracker and Knight, if you're playing against any non-combo deck, like, Tireless Tracker plus Knight is going to win you the game. In a very, not a similar fashion, but almost as efficiently as Retreat. Obviously, Knight plus Retreat will just win you the game on the spot, but Knight plus Tracker will pretty much almost always win you the game on the spot if you're playing against, you know, Abzan, Jund, Blue-White-Red, Grixis Control, even another mid-range, like Eldrazi Taxes kind of deck. You know, just getting, like, 4 clues right away, and you have a huge Knight, you have a huge Tracker, is just kind of insurmountable for a lot of decks in Modern. And that's why I like it, because if you play against those decks like Jund and you have Coral Helms instead of Tireless Trackers, if they just Abrupt Decay your Knight or Path your Knight, Liliana your Knight, you are stuck with a retreat in your hand that just does absolutely nothing. And the reason that I play one is because I think that on the flip side, there are benefits of the retreat. And I'm building this deck to beat fair decks, but, if you play against Tron, if you play against Infect, if you play against like a deck like Dredge that can't actually really remove Knight outside of like some Abrupt Decays that they might not bring in, then just having the retreat Knight combo is pretty important. I completely understand if you look at this deck and you add another retreat, it makes it more fun, it makes it more combo-y. There's nothing wrong with that, but for my purposes, I like the trackers, so let's go to the trackers. Trackers a card that it doesn't see much play in Modern, but I like it a lot, And the other thing about having trackers over Coral Helms is that your companies are better, which is nice. But Tracker just takes over the game pretty quick. We're playing 10 fetch lands, which is a bit high, but a lot of the times, having those trackers can get you back into any game if you have a bad draw or your opponent, has a slow draw. Like Tyler's Tracker is super, super punishing. Pretty solid card, draws a bunch of cards. That's pretty much it. There's nothing really, well, I guess the flashy, nothing really flashy about it, but it is really good with Knight. It is really good with fetch lands. Courser of Crewfix. I think the first Courser is better than the fourth Tracker. You don't want to have too many trackers. There are a lot of games when you end a lot of games with a bunch of clues in play. Pretty much always you're winning those games, so it doesn't really matter, but you can get too many clues. So Courser is a card. I like it because it survives Bolt and it survives Anger. And it just helps you get to the fourth land. Like, Tracker doesn't actually help you get to the fourth land for company. You can just be stuck on lands with the Tracker. And if you, like, for instance, it's better to draw one Courser and one Tracker than two Trackers, because the Courser helps, find you the extra lands for Tracker and whatnot. So that's the reasoning there. 4 Spell Quellers. This is, like, the innovation that makes the deck a lot better, I think. It synergizes really well with company. Obviously, you can company in a Spell Queller. That's unbelievable. Also, you can hold up mana, and your opponent has to respect both Spell Queller and company. Against a lot of the combo decks of Modern, having just 4 Spell Quellers, like, that's honestly, obviously we have more counters in the sideboard, but that could be enough to disrupt their combo. If you counter their Ensnaring Bridge, or if you counter an Oblivion Stone, if you can counter, there's tons of stuff. If you counter a Phyrexian on life, you can just win the game on the spot. A lot of these decks don't have that much removal. And, we're putting pressure on them, the Spell Queller counters. And then if you have double Spell Queller, against a combo deck, it's pretty hard for them to win. Spell Queller looks like a card that would just die a lot. But, we play the Spell Skites, we play the Selfless Spirits, we play the Cocos. So even if this is dying, we're getting tempo off of it. And even against the fair decks, like a 2/3 flyer flash, it sounds pretty ridiculous. Even saying this sounds ridiculous, but it's not that bad. It's not that bad just... as a card you can flash out, because if they just don't play anything into it, you just gain a bunch of tempo. You can end of turn play a company or a Spell Queller. So I think it's pretty great. I think it makes the deck. It's just really solid. Obviously, we're pretty much splashing blue for it. Last card, 2 cards, I guess. Knight of the Reliquary. Knight of the Reliquary is unbelievable. It's a card that is... I'm not going to say it's underplayed in Modern, because there are just tons of ways of killing it efficiently. I'm not going to lie if I would say I'm nervous about this deck after Fatal Push is printed. People are going to have more ways of killing Knight. But Knight, just similar to Tracker and also Spell Queller. I said this, probably sound like a broken record, but if you get to untap with these cards, it's pretty easy to win. Knight kills your opponent really quickly. And actually, before going into the companies, I guess we'll talk about the companies before talking about the lands. The company, it's kind of funny I say so many different cards make this deck, but pretty much all the pieces are super important, except for the interchangeable 2-drops. Company is just your, it's good and makes your deck unfair, and it also makes your deck good, like, fair. Like, it's kind of weird. Like, it lets you, get huge... What is the way of putting this? Even against a combo deck or a fair deck, this card is absurd. It puts pressure on the combo decks, helps you find your interaction against the combo decks, and against the fair decks, it's just like a straight up 2-for-1. So it's just really solid. 4 mana is a lot. It makes you build your deck in a weird way, but company makes it all worth it. And that is pretty much where I'm at with company. Let's talk about the lands because it's pretty important for the night. First off, fetch shock mana base. So we're talking 3 forests, 1 plains, no basic island. A breeding, one of each shock land, so a breeding pool, Hollowed Fountain, and a Temple Garden. And then we have 1 Stomping Ground. That's just to activate the Kessig Wolf Run and to play as its Staticaster, which can be awkward at times, but it's not that much of a cost. Kessig Wolf Run, Gavney Township, Ghost Quarter, Horizon Canopy. Those are your night targets. Now, just talking a second, pretty interesting that I normally win with Gavney Township. Like, getting Gavney Township is almost always better than getting Kessig Wolf Run, I've found. But it's the kind of situation where Gavney Township will win you the games like 90% of the time. And then the other 10%, like Gavney Township will do nothing, but Kessig will win you the game. Like if you're in like a ridiculous race, pumping your whole team might not help, but just giving one night trample, can be really, really good. And a lot of the times, once you get ahead and you get a Kessig Wolf Run in play, your opponent can't win. Whereas Gavney, if they draw removal, they can get back into it, but Kessig makes every one of your threats insane. So that's why you play the Kessig. It's possible you don't need it, but Kessig's reasonable. Gavney Township's reasonable as a win condition once you get the knight in play. Ghost Quarter, obviously great against Infect. It's great against Affinity. It's really important against Tron. Against Death Shadow Zoo, they don't have any basics game 1, so it's just Strip Mine. Pretty solid card. Like, you're playing 22 lands with a bunch of colorless lands, which can be a little bit awkward, but that's why we have all the mana creatures. Ghost Quarter is solid. Then Horizon Canopy. I'm not actually that big of a fan of it. I don't find myself using it that often, but it is nice to fetch up a card, to get a free card draw out of the night, to ensure you win the game if you're not already just like dominating with the night. All right, now let's go into the sideboard. So we have 2 Stony Silence. Pretty typical. If you're playing white, I think you should probably be playing Stony Silence. I keep seeing on the internet people saying, Affinity is going to come back with the bannings, which I don't really have a strong opinion either way. I know that like Infect was really good against Affinity, so maybe that's the case, or maybe just less people playing those kind of combo decks and playing Affinity, or people think there's less hate. But if anything, I think that like if people are cutting Dredge hate from their sideboard, they might replace it with Affinity hate. Anyway, that being said, Stony Silence is good because it's not only good against Affinity, but it's really good against Lantern. There's 4 matchups, right? Lantern, Tron, and the last one it's pretty good against Ad Nauseam as well. So Stony Silence, pretty solid. Just a huge blowout against those decks, so I think playing 2 in any white deck is reasonable. 2 Elspeths, this is kind of interesting because we're already kind of playing this really fair creature game, but like I said, I really want to beat the mid-range decks, and I think that Elspeth is particularly good because against a lot of the mid-range decks like Abzan and Bant Eldrazi, they'll be pathing you, so you get extra lands, but against the non-path decks, like John and Grixis Control, I'm not saying easiest way to lose is, but it's kind of hard to play against sweepers with this deck. Like, yeah, you can exile it with Spell Queller, but they can't kill it. Maybe you can end up turn Company, but, your deck is just so many creatures that even with Company, it's hard to play around Wrath of God and also put pressure on your opponents. Elspeth is the perfect card because it allows you to play something that doesn't die to the Wrath of God. It sounds pretty ridiculous at 6 mana, but I've had many games where I'm, like, crushing Jund, and I'm already winning, and I play an Elspeth, and it's like, well, you're already winning, but if they draw Damnation, it would be back to square one, basically, and the Elspeth just ends the game. So I think Elspeth is really solid. 4 counterspells, Tuna gets 2 Unified Wills. The split is mostly because Unified Will can counter Primeval Titan, which is pretty nice, and it can also counter like Wormcoil Engine or World Breaker or something like that, where Negate can't. I guess sometimes you can get punished, but I haven't run into that yet, and I've had Unified Will be pretty good because I've played against Valakut a few times. So I think the split is reasonable. Obstinate Baloth. This card is kind of a weird one of in this deck because like it doesn't come off Company or anything, but I found that this actually comes in a lot of matchups. It's obviously good against Burn. One of the things about this list is I cut out the Kitchen Finks because you just have so many 3-drops with the trackers that I just can't ever fix. Like with these, the Reflector Mage and Staticaster 2, I just can't imagine having that many 3-drops in your 75. With Imagine 3 Finks as well, that's like 23 drops. It just makes no sense to me. So I wanted some Burn hate. I think Obstinate Baloth is solid against Burn. Yeah, if they Skullcrack you, they might still win that game, but maybe not. or sorry, you might still win that game anyway. And Obstinate Bailoff, if you resolved against Burn and you gain 4, you just win. I don't think they're going to beat that very often. And it gets around Eidolon too, so it's pretty solid there. Not only is it burn hate though, but the reason that I play this, even though it's a one of that can't be hit by company, is that it's actually versatile. Like, I find this card to be really good against Jund because they have Liliana the Veil. I find this card to be really good against Grixis Control because they have 4 Kolaghan's Command, which can be a huge blowout. And I find it to be good against Eldrazi too because they have Reality Smasher. So if you path their Smasher, you can discard the Bailoff, which is just a huge tempo swing. They spend 5 mana for Obstinate Bailoff. You kill it, or sorry, for Reality Smasher, you path it, put the Bailoff into play. And the other thing in that matchup is the 4 life is pretty nice because I actually find that you have some inevitability against them. Yeah, they do have Drowner Displacer, but if you can not just get crushed by early Thought-Knots and Reality Smashers, like I have tons of awesome cards like Company, Tracker, Knight, Elspeth, stuff like that. Reflector Mage, Obstinate Bailoff. Also, it's a card that they can't just. A lot of the times they might displacer you out, but Obstinate Bailoff can't really be displacered because you gain 4 off of it. Anyway, talking a lot about one Obstinate Bailoff, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to explain it because it's a very weird sideboard card, and I have 2 Reflector Mages. Now, this is kind of like, what are these Reflector Mages doing? Why aren't they in the main? I find that Reflector Mages is pretty good against creature decks because this deck does struggle a lot of the times on the draw, especially against decks that can, like, kill your birds. If I'm playing against a Jund deck and they bolt my birds, or I don't have one, and they play a Tarmogoyf, it's like Liliana or Scavenging Ooze, it is really nice to have a bounce effect, and I find that on the draw against a lot of the Lightning Bolt decks, Spellcrawler isn't very good, because by the time you hold it up, it's either obvious or you're behind, and not really the most efficient thing, but a lot of times you'll bring in Reflector Mages for Spellquellers when you're on the draw. Also, just a solid card, I bring this in against Infect, I bring to buy myself time, I bring it in against, obviously Bant Eldrazi and Jund, like it's really nice to reset their Scavenging Oozes and stuff like that. Just a solid, it's a weird sideboard card, because I would say, I'm not going to say it's low impact, but it's just not insane. 2 is Staticasters. I'm unclear how good these are. I haven't played against much Infect or Affinity online recently, but that's pretty much what they're there for. If you play against any random tokens decks, they're good. Like if you play against Abzan, especially Dark Confidant Abzan, they're insane because they have Lingering Souls and Dark Confidant. We're splashing it, and they're actually don't think that this is easy. This card is very hard to cast in this deck because green and blue are both your splash colors. Blue and red are both your splash colors, and Noble Hierarch doesn't even make red. So I might actually cut red out of the deck completely, but as of now, I have the Staticasters in there. Ghost Quarter number 2. This is actually a recent addition. Very, very effective, I found. There are a ton of decks that Ghost Quarter is good against, and the second Ghost Quarter can be backbreaking. I found I played against Tron, and Tron's obviously a bad matchup. But if you get if you play a turn 2 Knight, turn 3 Knight, and you can Ghost Quarter them, that's good. But, they can just re-Tron, they can buy time. The second Ghost Quarter is insane. Being able to Ghost Quarter a piece and Ghost Quarter another piece, you can most likely keep them off Tron for a long time. So that's why I initially put the Ghost Quarter in, but then I found it to just come in a lot of matchups. There are a lot of matchups where you are in a, you want to be able to not die to Inkmoth Nexus, which is obviously Infect, and Affinity Ghost Quarter is great. Like Death Shadow Zoo, they side in a basic, but having an extra Ghost Quarter can be super nice. There are some matchups, like fast matchups, like Affinity, where like Kessig Wolfrun is like never going to help you. So, the Ghost Quarter is pretty nice. I'm trying to think if there's any other decks you might side it in against. I'm running a blank, but sometimes I even side up to 23 lands when I know they're going to be killing my birds and stuff. Ghost Quarter is solid. And then the Bajuka Bog, obviously for Dredge. The Dredge this deck actually has a pretty good Dredge matchup. You have Ooze and Knights, and they do have Abrupt Decay. They don't always bring them in, but Knight just beats them pretty quickly because you just get a Bajuka Bog, slow them down, and then, they can't really block that well, and you have a huge Knight. That was a pretty long deck tech. Got dragged on a little bit too long. Go ahead and watch the videos if you want. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you guys in the matches.